Hi, I'm Darren Crumwoody and welcome to Modeling 3. Now what we're going to learn in this lecture is how to work with a very complex organic shell-like surface. And we're going to use the model of a GTP race car as our learning tool or vehicle to take us through this. And the process that I'm going to cover is basically the way to establish a very primitive or shell-like body to begin with. This would be done through, say, the form of using the bi-rail tool. And then through using a whole suite of NURBS modeling tools, such as the bi-rail, in addition the square tool and the freeform fillet, and curve networks and offsetting, and virtually all the NURBS modeling tools, you'll be able to take that primitive form and add a lot of secondary detail, which will start to describe and bring out the form and all its characteristics. So at the end, you're going to have a pretty good understanding of virtually all the NURBS modeling tools in that modeling menu, and be able to work with these tools and apply them towards some other complex surfaces and projects that would work in a similar fashion. So hope you enjoy this particular lecture, and happy modeling. Okay, so in this modeling video, what we're going to cover is the steps to model this particular car, which is using a lot of things like bi-rails, freeform fillets, some lofting, and a few of the circular fillet types, as well as some of the even planar tools. So in what we've covered in previous type of videos in the 1 and 2 section, we're just moving a little bit further into adding more detail, dealing with more organic and refined shapes and surfaces, such as this hard shell surface in a car. So we're going to go through and kind of break down the different steps. We'll take each component in a separate section and talk about how each one of those was created, dealing with all the issues of trying to blend together different forms. So getting the fillets that integrate second levels of detail, such as fenders and bumpers and this little raised section, trimmed out areas, a lot of trim and duplicate, and even using a lot of the offset type tools, as well as extrude. So hit a little bit of everything. Now, the first thing we're going to start with is building the main body form, which I have highlighted here, which essentially uses the bi-rail tool and then mirror the two halves, two copies to the other side, or one copy to the other side, and then deal with trimming out the various components of this to add on some of the secondary detail that we have here. So in my first scene, if we go into that file, we'll see that there is a series of curves that make up this side surface. Okay, and this is using what is called the bi-rail tool, and in particular this surface was created using bi-rail 3. So if you go under the surfaces menu into the bi-rail section, you'll see that there is a bi-rail 1, 2, and 3 plus tool. This one we use 3 plus, meaning that we have multiple cross-section curves that are being used to generate along these two rails. So this curve, the second one, third, fourth, and even fifth curve are all part of your cross-section or construction curves, and then we have two rails, one here at the top and one at the bottom. So bi-rail is kind of like a sweep or a loft, but it follows the two rails of control to keep the cross-sections together. Now, one of the things you need to be aware of when you're using bi-rail is curves always have to connect. So that anytime that I'm trying to create a rail, I need to have one curve touching onto the rail at both the top and the bottom section. So you always have to make sure that works, otherwise bi-rail will fail. So the first thing I'm going to do is set up how I would go about creating these curves, and then we can use this template of the pre-built curves as kind of a model to stage the next shot or the next modeling part, where we're going to go in and add the top section. So I'm going to hide this for a second and talk about how I'd actually develop these curves. First thing I would do is go into something like a top view and develop what I want the top kind of profile to look, or elevation of what that curve shape would do from the front to the back. So I'm going to go into my Create CV Curve Tool menu, make sure that I am on the 3-degree or cubic curve setting. And I'm going to start drawing curves that basically go from the center line out and then back to the center line. So for this, I want to make sure I use things like grid snap so I can get the first point sitting right there on top of the grid, and using this as my mirroring axis going in the top view across the Z from top to bottom. So I want to snap this right on that grid, on that horizontal grid from the top view, and then grid snap the next point so it is also on that grid but basically perpendicular to that center line. So I have 2 points right here, and then we can continue developing what we want the shape to look like, trying to keep a minimal amount of points but still be able to describe shape as well as possible. And then when I get to the end here, I want to also use something like a grid snap or a means to make sure those last 2 points are lined up. So I'm going to grid snap this one and then put another one right there. Okay, so I have those 2 last points, and then we can go in and shape the model a little bit, being aware that these last 2 points should stay in a row. So if I want to pull a little more tension here, I'm going to pull this CV back a little bit, pull the one up here in the front a little bit more, and then we have 2 in the middle that can basically sit right there, kind of even along that horizon line. So in perspective, we have 1 curve. Okay, now when I'm talking about a bi-rail, we need to have at least 2 curves that exist as your rails. So in a very simple case, what I'm going to do is just duplicate this curve and move it up so that I just have a copy. So I'm using as a hotkey just that duplicate with transform, Shift D, and then I'm just moving up 1 single copy of it. So a quick copy, we don't have to worry about what our duplicate options in the above menu are set up with. So just copy it and move it. Now this can exist as our 2 rails. The next thing we need to have is some kind of control curve that's going to be going through here. Now because bi-rail needs to have the CVs or points connected or snapped at least to those rails, what I'm going to do here is go into my Create Curve menu and select on the EP curve, okay, not the CV curve. And the EP curve is always useful because this type of curve drawing, you don't need to click down 4 points, and you can snap basically the beginning and end of the curve to snap to the rails right here and here, and then go in and adjust what you want that profile to look like or how you want that curve to bow out here. So I'm going to use again the cubic or 3-degree curve for edit point curve drawing, but this time I'm just going to curve snap onto that rail at the top and then curve snap the second point right there on the bottom. And this will create the entire curve. Again, you don't need to have 4 points with the EP curve, and it's very easy to get things to snap right on there. So if I hit Y to repeat the that last tool, and then I'm going to curve snap on to the second set of rails, or basically on the back end here, and then hit enter to finalize it. Okay, so what this gives me now is a complete closure, which will allow me to do one of the bi-rails, which says that I have 2 rails here, meaning bi-rail, and then I also have 2 cross-section lines, or basically curves, going between that surface. So if we go up to our surface menu and come down to bi-rail, you'll see again there's bi-rail 1, 2, and 3. What bi-rail 1 means is you always have 2 rails, but this case you have 1 generation curve that you're going to sweep across there. So for bi-rail 1, you need to have a minimum of 3 curves, meaning that I could use this as my cross-section, and then that as my rail, and that as my rail, and get a surface generated from this. Okay, and I'm not utilizing the last curve right now. And with history, you can go in and change stuff as long as you keep the idea that those curves need to stay together. So let's move this one cross-section out a little bit, and you can see that that sweeps that cross-section through those rails completely from front to back. Notice that this other curve, the back here, isn't being used right now, because this is just a bi-rail 1 generation curve. Now also with history, you can go in and select the midsection. So if I want to say, push this part up or down and readjust how I kind of want the profile to look, or the side view of that, pushing this rail up or moving it in, and be able to have that sweep still historically update through the various cross sections here. Now this bi-rail 1 is just going to be limited by, you only have that one cross section curve. So if we remove the surface and try to get a bi-rail 2, that means that I can take the second generation curve here and go in and manipulate its control points. So we're going to pull these in this time, so I kind of have an out concave to a convex situation right here. And I'm going to go in and select the bi-rail 2 tool this time, which will allow us to again select and create a swept surface, but we need to have 4 curves total. So your 2 rails and your 2 cross-section curves. Now when you're using this one, it's a little bit trickier as far as picking order really needs to be looked at. When you're using bi-rail, it is one of those command settings that is a tool. That means that usually what the tool says is you need to select the command first and then go out and pick the curves. So in previous commands like loft, you may go and pick all your curves first and then say loft. Here it gives us this separate pointer type, this little arrowhead, and if you read down at the prompt at the very bottom where the help line is, it says select 2 profile curves. So I'm going to select this as a profile and this is a profile, and now it says to select 2 rail curves. So this rail and then that rail, and again you're going to get your sweep through the bi-rail, this time looking at both curves. Now if we flip this around, you can see that now it's utilizing the look of that one as well as the characteristics of that first one. Now if we look at the attribute editor for bi-rail, it will show at the top the input curves. So what is your profile 1 and 2, what is your rails, and then the transform mode, which says proportional, which you can also switch to non-proportional. Now the difference between proportional and non is how is it going to actually scale up or down your input profile curves, and how they're going to deal with, say, changes in your rail distance. So let's look at that for a second. If I take one of my rails here and say start extending some of these CVs up, okay, so I'm creating a situation where it's much thinner here and much thicker over there. What is that bi-rail going to do at this point when it deals with the cross sections at the midsection of that body between the 2 rails? Well, if we look at our bi-rail setting, non-proportional is going to scale that curve and actually kind of stretch it through this area so that it is going to be scaling non-proportionally, or maybe more in the Y direction in this case, than it is going to be scaling in the other 2 directions of the curve, or say the Z direction. So when you flip this to proportional, you will get a slight change here, as it is still scaling that curve up, but it will just pop between a little bit more non-proportional linear scale this way versus trying to scale the entire curve and keep a little more of the curvature in here. Whereas normally if we took this curve and scaled it up, it would tend to look flatter as that arc got flatter over a distance of scale. So that is one of the things that you can change in the bi-rail, and particularly like bi-rail 2, that is going to be a valid transform mode change that you can make here. Okay, the other thing you're going to see, especially in bi-rail 2, is you have something called a blend factor. Blend factor allows you to modify which curve in your 2 curve bi-rail, front and back here, has most influence. So by changing the blend factor, right now it's at 0.5, meaning somewhere about in the middle of our rail, it's utilizing a kind of morphosis between the front and the back and getting something in between those 2. Which, if this one is a little more convex and this is a little more concave, by the time you get to the middle, essentially that profile is almost going to be a straight line. So you can influence the blend factor And you'll see that when I move this to 0, it's using essentially this first curve has most influence all the way through here. So this stays a little more concave all the way through that profile as we look down here. If I move the blend the other way, okay, then it starts to utilize that front curve or carry this type of convex or pushing out kind of profile further down the body. So even back down here, we can see that that is going to be curving out more. And then eventually it's going to hit the way your curve looks at the end again. So that is a BiRail 2 situation. Now, one of the things with BiRail 2 that also makes it a little more unique is that you really have 4 curves, and any of those 4 curves can be your rails. Say like these two could be the rails, and these two can be your profiles. So because this is a sweeping type tool, you're either sweeping this curve, transforming through that curve along this rail this way, or it's taking this curve and transforming through here. So in effect, you can get 2 different results from BiRail depending on the order you pick in. So if we do the one we did last time, front and back, then rail and rail, and it'll hit 3, and just kind of move that to the side here. And then do BiRail again by hitting Y to repeat that tool. And then we're going to take this as a profile, and that a profile. This is our rail, and then the back curve is our rail. Okay, so with these 2 surfaces, there will be slight changes. And if you push them over each other, you're going to see that they actually don't match up perfectly. Okay, so there is a point where this is kind of popping through, and these are not exactly the same surfaces, because the sweeping operation will create differences depending on direction here. So this one looks like it's a lot flatter in its profile, and this one looks like it's a little bit better where it's curving and taking into consideration these shorter curves here. So that's typically the way I would do it, is take the shorter curve and make that my generation. Now, going back to BiRail 1, okay, when we select this as, say, generation, path, and path, and we get our curve here, notice that you don't have the blend tool in your attribute editor. Okay, so there's no blend slider. You can still use proportional and non, which will factor how that generation curve changes through the wider span between the rail, but you can't use the blend control between front and back. Alright, now the next thing is BiRail 3, which would be something where you go in and take multiple generation curves. So if I curve snap another control in the middle of this, and then go in and hit Y to repeat last command, and C to snap a point here and a point here, now we have the idea where we have more than 2 generation curves, and essentially we could take this one and say move it out as well, and then take this other rail section and also move it out and push it up. Okay, so now I have more rails, basically 4 generation curves here. Now with this, BiRail, if you go back into your BiRail tools, you'll see BiRail 3+. This, in terms of options, isn't going to give you blend control, and it will still use the proportional or non-proportional kind of setup. But beyond that, you need to actually specify when you're done picking rails, because it doesn't have a predetermined amount of rails. It's 3+, so 3 meaning 3 or more, and then infinitely as far as the number of cross-section curves that you could actually have there. So what I'm going to do here is go in and start selecting my profiles, 1, 2, 3, and then 4. And then it needs to know when I'm done to start selecting the rails. So I hit enter, and then look for the prompt at the bottom here that says select 2 rail curves. So I go 1 and 2. And then we'll get to our BiRail 3+. Okay, now in a tool like this, you have to watch out a little more because it can give you more cross sections through the middle of it as it's trying to adapt to the changes in your rails. Okay, and depending on the severity between each one of these original construction curves, it can influence the amount of points that that rail is going to need to basically design the cross sections here. And rails will also have to throw in a lot of extra isoparms to facilitate kind of the weird breaks that happen in the middle of your surface. So when I'm designing something like this cross-section in the model, okay, I may start out just using a front curve and a back curve, and then do point pushing and pulling to get the rest of this body shape in here. Okay, and looking down and kind of saying that I need to have a more biased curvature up here, and then towards the bottom, maybe this goes a little bit flatter. So depending on how you want to control it, bi-rail 2 is a good one, or you can go all the way up and start generating multiple cross-section curves. Now, for the sake of the model here, to get the same control of what I had in the last body that you just saw, I went and generated 5 bi-rail curves. Okay, and each one of these is changing to adapt to the various cross sections that I need to have at that particular zone. So this has a much more raised and kind of flattened top section, and then curves down. And then this one right here is a little bit flatter on the side, and then that's a little more rounded, and then so on. And then this has a much larger back sweep into that section right there. Okay, so when I'm bi-railing something like this, I'm going to use the bi-rail 3 for this particular one, and then we'll go through and make all the cross sections. Now, another way you can work with bi-rail is to do things in actually sections and then go in and attach them together, because bi-rail does have some tangent history or tangent control between separate objects. So let's try that one as an example. We're going to go into a bi-rail 2, okay, and first thing I'm going to do is say select that cross section, and then let's just use this midsection, and then go in and finalize this is the top. Even though this is a much larger or longer curve, it's going to stop right here, and then use the bottom section. So bi-rail doesn't have to be an endpoint curve or stop right there. You can use a partial bi-rail of, basically use a partial rail for that cross section. Okay, so I have this part developed. And notice that I maybe need to pull that out by pushing on CVs, or even do something like a bi-rail 3 here. Now for the back half, we could do do the same thing, where that'll be a cross section, and then up at the front, when I already have an existing surface, I want to go in here, and bi-rail is going to automatically pick the isoparm of the existing surface and use that as its reference edge, not the curve that was there. So it's actually automatically picking the isoparm. And then we pick on that rail, and then the rail here, and then we get the basically the completion of that other half. Now this object is not going to be tangent or seamless yet. If you render it out or throw some shaders on here, you can see that the isoparms aren't lining up, and that they're kind of coming off at an angle here. Okay, so one of the controls with bi-rail, particularly bi-rail 2, if you go to the attributes for it, you have 2 checkboxes here called Tangent Continuity Profile 1 and Profile 2. So this can make the new surface, or basically the second surface, tangent to the first one. And where it says Tangent Continuity Profile 1, if I click on that one, I'm telling the first profile curve to be tangent to some other surface. But there isn't one here, so it's not going to do anything other than give you an error. Whereas tangent on number 2, so if we bring that up and click on tangent 2, it's going to go in and do a fine-tuned adjustment to this. So if I click this off and then click it back on again, you're going to see a real subtle change in the mesh. Okay, the closer that these two surfaces are similar already, the less likelihood that you're going to notice a big tangent change here. Okay, we may notice it a little more as I start to kind of add some severity to the blend factor. But other than that, you're going to get the same kind of butting up of these two surfaces, and they're going to look similar. Now, I may do this just to control sections, and I may not so much worry about the tangent continuity between these two halves, because as a third step, I'll go in here and actually attach those two surfaces. So in that case, we go in and grab something like an isoparm of that edge, right click, grab the isoparm of the other edge, So I'm marking that area and then go into Edit NURBS and say Attach Surface. Okay, and we're using Attach with the blend method. And I may turn off knot insertion so it doesn't add those extra points inside there. And that will give you a definite smooth cross-section blending between this particular bi-rail. So you can do it in sections, do the whole thing at once, try different methods and see which one works best. I like more using bi-rail 2, front and back, and split it somewhere in the middle and then go and attach the surface. You tend to have a little bit better control there. Okay, so that can give us our cross-section. Now the next thing we want to look at, open up another scene here, is once I have that section created, and here I've gone in and fine-tuned it a little bit more, sometimes going in and pushing and pulling on a few CVs to stretch and add tension where I want it, but essentially I'm just working off that original bi-rail. Now I'm going to need to create this top section here, which on our other model is this piece, okay, which is the top piece that is just blending between two halves, or the two copies here. Now this is going to be kind of a little cheat, but it does work in that to get the top to look fairly smooth or integrated between them, I'm going to do something similar to a loft, but it's actually going to be a freeform fillet that joins the two halves here. So the first thing I'll need to do is go in and mirror copy this to the other side. So make sure my pivot point is sitting over here at 0, which it is not. So let's turn on our grid and hit insert, snap my pivot basically back to center, hit insert again, and then I'm going to go in and duplicate and use the negative scale of Z. So X, Y, Z, go to that third column, third row, where it says scale, make that a -1, and then hit apply. Okay, so this is going to give us a closed off surface. Okay, and one of the things you're going to be noticing in my display throughout here, and this is something I changed earlier in my model, is I turned off double-sidedness in the renderer so that I either don't have to deal with the confusion of looking through the backside of the model, and this also acts as a rendering optimization so that when you are rendering your scene, it doesn't have to render both sides. Okay, you can go in and shading and turn on wireframe on shading to see both sides, but if you want to make it double-sided or a single-sided renderer, go to the attribute editor with that surface picked, come down to the area called render stats, and turn off double-sided. So right now this is rendering both sides, click it off, and it's only rendering one side. If it's rendering the wrong side, you can hit opposite, which is right below that double-sided checkbox, or you can go in and actually flip the normal of the surface, which is by going into Edit NURBS, Reverse Surface Direction. Okay, so that'll flip that one back the other way. So in either case, we have our two halves. Now what I'm going to do to kind of close off the top and try to get a smooth blending is I'm going to take the isoparm of this half and take an isoparm of the other half right at the top and go in and close them off. Now you do not want to use the loft in this case, because the loft is just going to give you a straight line, shortest distance between these two edges. Okay, so you're not going to get a very clean surface there, as far as it's going to be tangent or anything. So instead, I'm going to go into Edit NURBS, go down to the Surface Fillet options, and down here you're going to see something called a Freeform Fillet. Now with the Freeform Fillet, this works kind of like the loft, but you can only use two curves. So in order to make this work, I'm going to grab, again, an isoparm in that half, grab one from the other half, and then come down to Edit NURBS, Surface Fillet, Freeform Fillet. Okay, and that is going to generate, again, a surface that goes in between here, but one of the things you're going to note is it's going to start dropping down and doing some other kind of curvature changes in an attempt to keep this tangent from the top down. Okay, so this will actually check for tangency on both ends. And Freeform Fillet, you're going to get a few extra isoparms in the middle here. Like in this case, we have one in the middle, and if you right-click and turn on your hulls, you're going to see that you actually have 5 halls across here. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Whereas loft, you may end up with just 3 or 4. And this mid one is just controlling the way the lower kind of dip down section needs to look. Whereas the 2 halls on the end, right here, are trying to line up for tangency to that existing surface. So we do have a couple extra cross sections in here. Now you can change a few things in this. For example, you can change the depth of the freeform fillet, and you can change its bias a little bit. So if you go to the depth slider and we start to move this, okay, if we go down to 1, it will kind of flatten it out, and if you turn this up, you can see how 0 is going to give you completely flat. Going up to 1, it's going to start curving down a little bit more. Okay, so what's happening at the bottom is this thing's going to pull down and kind of tighten up. If we bring this back, it's going to try to keep those points a little bit closer together. So what's happening in this case is that second row of halls, which is controlling your tangency to the edge. By moving this, you're essentially moving these things in and out. So I can move it closer to the edge where it's going to stay tangent shorter distance, and then go down and drop. Now you can also change the thing called bias. Okay, bias will switch which side is controlling more of that rail, but you can see that isoparm is kind of moving to the left and right. Now that is going to throw symmetry off on our model, so I will keep the bias basically here in the middle, which will be at 0. But for my model, we saw in the other one, there's a lot more going on as far as the way the tension is being built along the edges here. Okay, the way this is kind of curving down a little bit sharper. So what I'm going to do for this is actually go in and add a few more control points in the middle of this surface. So for that, let's just hide the rest of the model here temporarily. So go and hide unselected. And I'm going to go in and add a few more isoparms in here. Now, for this thing, I don't want to go in and just grab isoparms and kind of drag them from here to here, because I don't know if I'm going to get them symmetrically inserted. So instead, I'm going to grab the isoparm at the end of both halves. Okay, so just highlighting those in yellow. And then go down to Edit NURBS, Insert Isoparm, and we're going to change the settings to do something called Between Selection. So that between these 2 selected points, we want to add 2 more rows of isoparms in the middle of this. So if I go in and say Apply, we're going to get something like that. Or if I want to have a little more control, we can go in and turn this up higher. Okay, so use something like 4 rows of isoparms in between. Okay, so that is just going to give us a little more control here, meaning that if you look at the halls now, it's really forced the last 2 halls on the end to be fairly far apart. And then these 2 halls are really close to the edge, but there's a much more broader area in between here that you have control over. So when I was creating this model, it was doing a little more kind of pushing and pulling, where I'd grab some of the interior CVs, say like these 3 rows right there, and then coming into a side view profile, as long as I know I have those picked, I'm going to go in and manually start repositioning where I want those 3 to go. Okay, and I'm being very careful not to pick the last 2 rows. Okay, so when you're looking at the model, the last 2 rows of CVs right along the edge, or basically those last 2 rows of halls running along this edge as well, you don't want to alter those, because that's going to break tangency with the rest of the model here. Okay, and you don't want to break the tangency right across this edge, otherwise you're going to notice a sharp seam there. So I'll start in moving these down, and then using my arrow keys of pick walking, okay, find the right direction. I'm using up and down here. You can then move down to, say, pull down that row, and pull down that one, and the one down here, and then continue until I get towards the end, and I'm not going to pull the last couple rows in the end to change the shape too much. Okay, and then we can continue pulling these down. Okay, say if this is going to recess a little bit, maybe you'll get to an area where this will cross, and that area will actually start to go higher, okay, towards the back. And if we look at the model, it is doing something similar to that, and then dipping back down again on the next section. Okay, so this will be dropping, dropping, and still more until we get towards the end. So you want to spend some time kind of smoothing these things out, but in the end you're going to have a much smoother section towards the middle as we're kind of designing how that cross section is going to look. And then you can go in and force a little more scale in here by taking a few interior rows, and then like I grab the 3 CVs in the middle and then start to scale them out to the edges. Okay, by scaling them out, we may even pick one more row here. Let's grab one more row. So I'm grabbing a total of 5 CVs down the middle and start to scale those out. And you can see that it's just going to build a little bit of pocket of tension here. And using the arrow keys to jump to the next row, scale those out, and scale those out in Z, and then continue scaling these out. So we're getting a much sharper kind of drop here, where that fender is basically going to jump over the top. So let's pull up that the rest of that surface here. Let's see where I hid that puppy. Okay, just have to dig for it a little bit. Okay, so I'm adding a little bit sharper kind of fender wall here with that type of tension. And then you can basically just continue to design how we want that front section to look. What I did here is I have another reference object, so let's just hide that temporarily. And then this is the top that I ended up with. So this object here, let's just open up that layer. Okay, so this is kind of what I ended up with. So I pulled a lot more tension down right here on the corners. Again, grabbing rows of CVs and just kind of pulling them down, and then adding a little more width here where I want this kind of hood section to start to V out and be a little bit less taper as it gets towards the corners here. So you can see there's less control there, and then it starts to drop down. And then back on the other side, we're doing the same thing, where this will drop down a little more severely and then have a little bit of a hump back right here. So we get this sort of little S transition going through right there, and a little S transition going through right there. So this was just trying to keep in line with the type of shape or the fluidity of form that I want to have going through here. A little more definition in the fenders, a little bit smoother up here at the top. Okay, so now we have a section like that. Now for our top piece, we want to get our little kind of canopy area, okay, which will be this section where the driver is going to be sitting. That is going to be a raised surface coming off of the top of the other one. So this we're going to use basically an extrude tool, or we could use a bi-rail tool for this. Okay, either one can work for that case. So I'm going to open up the next scene here where we have that set up for the canopy. Okay, and what I have now is the kind of the completed shape for these two forms, the two halves of the body side and then the top section. And then I drew a couple of curves here that I want to have for my canopy. So from a side view, just turn everything down to a level 1 display. Okay, and let's just template these things for temporarily so we can get this out of the way. Okay, now what I do is, in this case, is draw what I want that canopy to look like from the side view. So I go in with just a 3-degree curve and start laying in some points here. Okay, just to follow this kind of form. Going into a fairly sharp raise at the front, a fairly long sloping acceleration, deceleration in the back. And I actually made this so where that little humpback of the other shape was, okay, this is starting to become fairly close in line with that. Okay, so this is starting to follow right down where that edge is. It just dips below the surface just a little bit more. So I have that piece, and then the cross-section piece right here, okay, which is how I want the side view of that profile to look. Now for this one, to make sure you keep it symmetrical, which is not going to be easy if you're just drawing this right across one side to the other, I will just merely go in and draw a CV curve. Say that we snap the first point at the center, second point coming straight off here, and then we throw in the points the way we want our curve to look. And then I would mirror this to the other side. So we'd go into our duplicate tools again, or in this case I have a marking menu where I've set up some preset duplicates into that marking menu fired off by a hotkey. So I'll just say mirror on the z-axis just to flip over the other piece, make that go a little bit quicker. And then I'm going to take these two curves, and under edit curves I want to attach them. So edit curves, attach curves, using the blend option, and maybe not insertion if we want to add a few extra points in there to maintain control. So you just have to see how far that's going to move off. So if I turn off knots, is that going to pull away too severely or not? Okay, but either way, that will give me my cross-section curve for this particular extrusion. So we'll turn off that one. I'm just going to use the one that I already have built here. And I'm going to take the generation curve, select that first, and then the path that I want it to follow, and then go into our surfaces extrude, and we want to use the tube extrude, probably following the path curve, which we may change, and then use the component pivot. So pretty much all the right options, right column of check boxes over here, and then go in and apply it. Okay, and this will give us our cross section here. Now I may not say that this is my final model. What I'll do here is I'm going to go in and turn back on the templated body section, and then I'm going to make adjustments to my sweep surface to maybe follow the type of form that I'm trying to achieve here a little bit more, which is such that when we get towards the back, this may start to pull in a little bit more. So I'll grab a few of the hulls, okay, kind of looking down from this top view, and then go in and scale them so that these start to taper in a little bit, and then jump to the next row with my arrow keys and say that'll taper in a little bit more, and then finally that last piece will start to taper in a little bit more. So we end up with a little more rounded, kind of rounded intersection between those two forms. Okay, so that we can do a little bit more adjusting. Sometimes through the extrude you may get a little bit of like chatter or jitter in the side profile. So also look at this from the top view, and let's just hide the rest of the objects here. Let's grab that and go in and hide unselected, and turn on our hulls again and see what's going on in the middle of the surface as far as adjusting the hull so they don't kind of move up and down too much. Okay, you may even want to make sure you can see this a little bit easier by hiding the geometry. So go into display, object display, no geometry, and maybe even turn off our grid and look closely at what's happening from one hull to the next. So if it looks like this starts to come in too much, I may just slightly scale it out and then go to the next row and scale that one down a little bit to look for a more fluid line from one hull system to the next. Okay. You may even have a few hulls in here that are either unnecessary for the shape, or they're spaced too close together. So you could either try deleting the hull, paying attention to what at this point the surface may look like, okay, or start to just kind of come in here and space them out a little bit more and maybe rotate them a little bit, okay, just to get kind of a nice fluid form across there so that everything will look nice and clean in the end. Okay, and you can see deleting that one hull that I picked didn't do any justice here. So we didn't, deleting that hull didn't seem to help the form very much. Okay, so I may just end up moving it. Also, this could be responding to the extrude history. So at some point you may go in and delete history on that part of the model, and then see if dropping out a hull or two will give you a more negative effect here. Okay, so see how that's not doing as bad of a job as when we saw it kind of wrinkle up there. So history of the extrude was actually a factor in all that. Okay, so bring back the rest of the model. And as far as like the part that's really undercutting here or hanging below the surface, I'm not going to worry about that now. We can actually trim it later, or if we're not going to be seeing this through the middle of the model, I'm not going to worry about it and just allow it to just kind of stand free, just penetrating through the bottom part of that surface. Okay, so we have our top section. Now the next thing we need to do is actually throw on some kind of fillet that will integrate between these two shapes. So I want to get something that makes the canopy area and the body have a little bit more fluid, say, blend through something like a circular fillet here. Okay, now when you're doing a circular fillet, we need to be aware of, again, normals. So I may just temporarily go in here and display, under the display menu, go to NURBS components and turn on the normals in shaded mode. And you can see that those normals are now pointing to the inside of that shell. Now if I want to have a fillet that happens on the exterior of these two surfaces, I want the normals to be facing that way. So I'm going to set this up by reversing direction on that one, and then looking on this other surface, what is the normal display doing here, and that's also on the inside. So I will reverse direction on that one as well. Okay, so I have both of these little spikes pointing to the outside, meaning I'm going to get a fillet in this section. Otherwise, if it was reversed, we could get a fillet going on inside here, or maybe happening on the interior of that surface. So if you can do this first, it will make your fillets come out in a much more predictable way. So we'll go back to display, NURBS components, turn off shaded mode. And then I need to decide what size fillet I need. Well, if I just use my grid as a reference, go to display, turn on grid, and figure out how much fillet am I actually going to need in here. Is it going to be like a 1/2 centimeter, 1/4 centimeter, something like that, so that we don't go too big and it ends up taking too long to calculate the fillet. So I'm going to select both these surfaces, go into Edit NURBS, Surface Fillet, and then go down to Circular Fillet, and go to the options here, and decide what kind of radius I want. So let's start out with something fairly conservative like 0.2. I'd rather go smaller than larger and then work my way up. So 0.2 kind of works with this. We don't need to reverse primary and secondary normals, which decides which side the fillet is on, because we've already reversed the surface to make it look right. And then we want to turn on Create Curves on Surface, the checkbox at the top, so that later we can trim out the section by creating a curve on surface where that fillet joined between these two surfaces. So I could trim out the underside where it's kind of flashing down through the middle here. Okay, so let's go in and hit 3, turn on Smoother Display, and then have our fillet at 0.2, and then go in and apply this one. Now, if fillets start taking too long, it usually means that it is going to try to do it on the wrong side of the surface, or the fact that the fillet is just way too big. Okay, now something happened here where it actually did put the fillet on the wrong side. Okay, so it didn't really pay attention to my normals after flipping them. It could be a symptom of a history-based problem, though, that reversing with history still on kind of remembers the old surface, and then even though we reverse the normals, it thinks it's on this side still. So that kind of blew that idea of trying to pre-predict it. So then next thing I need to do is figure out I need to flip the fillet. Well, it is still happening on the outside of this canopy shell because the fillet is not on the inside, but it is happening on the wrong side or the lower side of this surface. So what I'm going to do is look at this surface in my fillet, which is called node something 442 detached surface up in the channel box. And if I go to the attribute editor for that fillet that we created, okay, which is the RBF surf node, up here it lists the primary and secondary surfaces. So I need to know which one was secondary or which one was this surface so I can flip the fillet by giving it a negative radius value. So if the secondary surface listed here is this one that's highlighted, then the radius, I will give it a negative value here. So I'm going to type in negative 0.2. And then this will cause the fillet to flip to the other side by basically inversing it on this section of the surface. Now when it reversed it, the fillet ended up being really small. Okay, tiny little fillet going on right here. So I can gradually step this up by changing the size of the fillet and maybe give this to be a 0.3 or 0.4 and then give the other one a negative 0.3 or 0.4 value. So sometimes you'll get failing if they're both not kind of consistently the same size. It just depends on what you can get away with. Okay, and that will build my fillet, then going through the surface from right here to right there. And we will see that if we turned on curve on surface, there should be a trim curve sitting on here as well. Okay, so if we go to a shaded mode level 1 and just come in here and look at our fillet, okay, which there is the fillet that got generated, and then right next to that will be a curve on surface. Okay, so this curve is actually part of the surface. You can see that I'm moving it around the surface right here. But this is a point where we can go in and trim out our surface. So if we go back to a shaded mode, I can trim out based on that fillet that was created and using these curves on surface to trim it back. So we go into Edit NURBS, Trim Surface, or Trim Tool, and then this will highlight the area where that actual trim curve is. And then we need to decide, do I want to keep up here or keep down here? In this case, we want to keep the upper canopy, so I'm just going to mark one part on here just by clicking with the mouse. Okay, and you can click all over if you want, just as long as you stay on that top side. So that will open up and get rid of that lower section. And then this piece we can also trim by going back in the Trim Tool, and it will have another curve on surface that was generated based on where that fillet ended up on the second half. Okay, so we can get that into more of a hollow shell. Okay, so looking inside there, that's been basically scooped out, kind of like a Boolean operation, but now we have a fillet that is a transition between those two surfaces. Now with history, you could even go back and change this and change the radius, and we'll still try to trim it out. Okay, on my model, what I have here is a canopy with that fillet that was already created. Okay, so I select it right here. You'll see that there is the fillet section. Actually, that one doesn't have it. Let's open up the other one. Okay, it looks like my fillet is actually invisible. Okay, so we did already create it. Let's go back to another scene here where we do have our fillet. Okay, so what we're going to see next is where that fillet was actually joined together in the model. Okay, and then this is all trimmed out here. Okay, and I made this fillet just a little bit bigger by keeping the side of the canopy in just a little bit more, and then we trimmed it out, so that's the fillet running across the surface. Getting a little bit larger fillet. This is a radius of actually 1.0. That was able to fit in between these two surfaces. Okay, and then I threw on just a window shader, which we can change, but basically it's just a smoked transparent glass surface, and then we have our fillet joining between all those shapes here. Okay, so that'll create a smoother transition between them. Now, looking back on the model, the next thing I'm going to address is the idea of putting in these little air intakes. Okay, and these are also using fillets, and by intersecting with this other form here, which essentially is just a cylindrical section of tube that's being intersected into the main part of that body. Okay, so we come back down to here. The way I set this up is I have two curves. Okay, so let's go down to a lighter shaded mode. I have two curves here that I drew from circles. Okay, so we have a circle here and a circle here. They've been duplicated and just offset or move it back from the other one. And the circle, when I was generating it, I just kind of flattened out an existing kind of create primitive NURB circle, bring this up in the active view, and just by grabbing some CVs here, and going in and scaling this out, say non-proportionally, pull down these, scale it down a little bit flatter, pull the ends in by scaling both ends, and then we kind of square off that little air intake. Okay, so it's just grabbing CVs on both corners or both edges, side sections, and then going in and scaling it down. Okay, so I put that into position so that between here we can generate a surface just from here to here by doing a loft. Okay, and then I want to see how this is positioned in between my model. So I want to make sure that this is completely intersecting that part of the surface, and then having a place where I can actually again go in and generate some kind of fillet in here, okay, which will be a trimmed out transition between the front and the back surface. So if I don't know what my surface normals are, we can also try to guess. I'm going to pick that surface and then that one, and then go in here with my fillet tool and set up again just like we did for the canopy. So I'll go into circular fillet. I'm not sure what side I need to set up or what kind of radius, so I'm going to start out with a fairly small radius, maybe like 0.1, and then go in and apply that over the surface, and it may again put it in the wrong area. So we need to look at exactly where is that fillet going to stand right now. So it looks like it's happening on the inside of that surface, which is good because we want to have it kind of go cup underneath here, but it is also happening on the wrong side of this surface. So it is happening right on the top side of this. I actually want it to happen right there on the bottom side. So we'll have the same issue where we need to flip that secondary surface or whatever fillet that we had created here. So I'm going to go into my fillet input and change the secondary surface to negative 0.1. And then we'll wait for that one to update. And now we have a fillet that is starting to cut back underneath here. Okay, and it is also happening right there on the inside of that other section. So let's just dig down and find our little fillet here. Okay, and see how that is being created, where it is basically starting to cut back a little bit of roundedness through that other part of the surface, and we may need to get this to actually reverse on the other half. So we want the fillet to kind of come down this way. So you may need to flip both of these surfaces now. So I'm going to grab that one, and in my fillet tools also make this a negative 0.1. Okay, so we'll have that fillet, instead of gravitating towards the front, goes towards the back, and now we have kind of the proper little air intake that when we go in and trim this out, see what that thing's going to look like. So I'll go into the trim tool, again picking on this surface. We want to keep the kind of interior part of that air intake, so I'm going to move down inside here and select that just to eliminate the back section. Okay, so we have this wedge, and then the front part is eliminated. And then for this other section, I'll hit Y to repeat last command, and also trim it out, keeping outside of this hole. Okay, and that will give us this kind of air intake with a little bit of fillet radius that just kind of curves, again, down below that surface, and then connects on to this one right here. And we'll hit 3 so you can see you got that little kind of U fillet happening right there. Alright, and then that would be repeated, basically duplicate these curves for the other half to get both of them put in together. Alright, so that we can create our air intake. Now for the lower section, once we have this part done, we can start adding other types of detail. So for example here, load up this model, we have a lower air intake that will happen kind of at the bumper type of level. Okay, so it's going to be happening down below the rest of that surface. So what I'm going to be looking at is this section right here. Okay, where this is another kind of filleted out section taken from the lower half of the body, and also doing a circular fillet that is intersecting within this other kind of wedge section down at the base here. Okay, for this one, we can also look at dealing with both halves of our model, where I may not want to do this to both sections. Okay, so I can take half of this and just delete it for now, generate the fillet on this half, and then just mirror everything back over to the other side. So if I look at this from a side view, what I had generated here is just one curve that I'm going to project onto the side of the body. Okay, and this is just happening right here at the front. And that curve is going to give me a curve on surface right there where we can go in and say trim out a section or actually create some kind of intersection between those two halves here. So I'm going to grab this curve. Again, this is just a U curve. We start outside the body, come back around, and then back outside of the body again. So I'll grab the surface and the curve, and I'm going to place this on the surface by going into Edit NURBS and Project Curve on Surface. Now we want to make sure when we project the curve on surface that we have active view on. So we're projecting from this orthographic view. And then everything else should be set up fine. So we'll just apply that, and that will lay down a curve on surface, just like you see here. So from that side view, that U curve kind of extends all the way across this bumper section. Now you can move this curve around using history. Okay, so if I just center the pivot right here and go into translate, this curve can be moved forward and back or grab on points just to decide how you want that to look. So if you want a smaller opening or a much wider opening, you just extend that curve by moving it forward and back in the X direction, just till you get that section to look to the size you want here. Okay, so we have that curve. Now I can trim this out through the projection by going to Edit NURBS, Trim Tool, and here we're going to trim out this piece, keeping basically everything else in the body minus this little hole opening here. Okay, so that'll give me my trim section. Now this is going to use something similar to the way I did this fillet, but I'm going to do a little bit different thing where I'm going to create a curve instead of getting this kind of cylindrical opening and starting with that and intersecting it with a circular fillet like we did here. I'm going to go in and make my own kind of surface from the existing trimmed out whole section. So with this, we're going to right click on our surface, select the trim edge, which is the edge that has been generated by the trimming out of that hole, or trimming out of where we projected that curve on surface. And then I'm going to extract that or duplicate that curve off here. Okay, we're going to do this by going into Edit Curve and say Duplicate Surface Curve. Okay, and this basically just clones that trim edge, and then we can pull this back. Okay, so that will give me a duplicate copy of that trim edge, just slightly pull it back here, and I may need to scale it up a little bit if I want to make this whole opening a little bit different size. So we can go in here and just scale it, actually scale it down just a little bit, and if we want to scale it to the interior or make it a little bit smaller here, hit Insert and throw the pivot point right on the end of that curve. Okay, just like that, and then I'm going to scale this in a little bit to the side. So I'm making this a smaller version of that existing trim curve. Okay, now I'm going to take the same one again and go in and duplicate it by right-clicking Trim Edge. Again, extract a duplicate surface curve. And we're going to pull this one back as well, but not quite as far. And then also throw our pivot point right on the edge here. So curve snap it. And then scale this one down as well. So make it a little bit smaller, a little bit more to the interior. Now this can be my generation curve between here and here to do a loft. So I'll build just like a real basic kind of tunnel or hole opening from that one, and then we can create a surface fillet off of here. And then I'm just going to reposition this a little bit. Okay, maybe go into a side view so we can see what's happening here. And say that let's just pull this up a little bit, maybe pull it forward a little bit. Okay, and then I'm going to take that back curve that I created with history and be able to pull this up. Maybe if we want to get the same angle or have this thing kind of flatten out here. So all we're doing is just conducting how we want this interior opening to look, but I'm leaving a gap between here and its edge. And then we can build a fillet through this by just leaving a gap, and this time using the freeform fillet. Okay, so I'll go down to Surface Fillet, Freeform Fillet, and we're going to generate it off here by again picking the trim edge of that surface and the isoparm of our loft surface. So we have these two curves highlighted. Go down to surface fillet and say freeform fillet. Okay, and this will close off that section here. Okay, giving us a nice little radius gap in between it, and then we can adjust how we want this to look by again changing the scale of it. So if we're getting a little bit of pinching here, I can hit insert, set my pivot for this object right on the center line edge again, so we don't want to mess up our center line. And then go in and deal with scaling issues. So if I want to scale this out a little bit or bring it a little bit closer, okay, maybe scale it a little more forward. Okay, scale a little bit forward in X as well. So all that can be just kind of do fine-tune adjust of where we want that fillet to stand. Now, if you don't like this method, you could do the same thing that you did for the other one, which was going in and scaling our creating our kind of hole opening and doing the fillet intersection. So that's just kind of an alternative means to create this interior piece. Sometimes you may get a little wrinkling if the fillet curve is going to be too severe, where the circular fillet could give you a little bit better result at times. All right, now we got the kind of the front opening done, our lower intake is done. And then we need to address the idea of start putting in things like wheel wells. Okay, where if you look at this model, okay, we have a wheel opening or wheel arch that is a little bit different. This is kind of a more organic interior blended wheel well. For this one, we're going to use a little bit more specialty kind of setup, meaning that I have two curves that I'm trying to go between, and I have some kind of path that follows around here. That could actually work for the idea of something like a bi-rail, but I'm going to get a little bit more detailed in how I actually set up these cross sections from the side here, and then the one in the front, kind of right around the opening of the wheel well. So the back one is pretty easy. That is just a straight-on circular cut-out opening that we're going to achieve through this one. So let's go back into our other scene. And what I generated here is two separate curves. One is where I want the interior of that wheel well to end up. Okay, so this is kind of sitting right inside where our wheel base is, just slightly to the interior of that tire. And then this other curve I'm going to project onto our surface. Okay, so this is going to be laying across here, which is the much larger kind of arched out opening that we have. So I'll select this curve that I drew, okay, which again just basic CV curve, and that surface. And we'll go into our side view, and you can see basically how that curve is sitting right here and how I want my wheel opening to look. And then we'll project this as a curve on surface. So edit NURBS, project curve on surface. Now this will give us our actual curve here that we can use for trimming out this section of the model. So I'm going to trim this out now, going into edit trim tool, pick on here, trim it, keeping everything outside of that wheel opening. And we have a much larger section removed here. And then I have another curve, like I said, right here, which is where I basically need to have some kind of closure going from here to here. Something that if we just did a straight-on loft between trim edge and that interior curve, this will give you kind of a visual of what that surface would need to look like. But the loft is clearly not going to give us a nice smooth transition. It's just going to leave a very hard edge here. Okay, and we could always do that and throw in some kind of circular fillet between here to do a transition, but that's not the way I'm going to do it this time. Okay, so let's hide our wheel. And this curve we're not going to use right now, so I'll hide that. And we're basically going to work off between these two curves. Now I'm going to set up a little more special kind of arrangement where this I'm going to bridge the gap between here using the curve on kind of the trim edge to right here, similar to the way we did a bi-rail as far as the initial setup. So I'll go into create edit point tool. Okay, so create edit point curve right there. And we're going to curve snap onto the end of that interior wall curve that we created, and then hit C and curve snap onto that trim edge. Okay, so we bridge that section there. And then I'm going to make another curve, hit Y to repeat last tool, C curve snap there, C curve snap right there. Okay, now I have a closure. So this could work with bi-rail, but again, our construction or generation curve isn't built that well, so that's not going to make it look very good yet. So I need to make this thing look smoother, like a nice smooth tangent transition coming off from this surface to that one. So for this, I'm going to take this curve and that surface. So these both are selected, and we're going to use a new tool under Edit Curves called Project Tangent. Now what Project Tangent does is makes a curve tangent to a surface. Essentially what happens here, if I turn on the CVs, and we look at this in a smoother display mode, it's altering or manipulating that second CV of the curve to make it tangent to our surface. Now right now the way it's trying to be tangent is the surface that's running more vertical here. And this happens to be, if we look at our Project Tangent, what is the tangent direction, which is right now set up to U. If I alter this or change it to be tangent in the V direction, okay, like that, now it's trying to make that second point tangent coming off the surface and then heading off into our model. Okay, so we want to make sure we get the right direction of rotation. This second point isn't really doing anything. So I can just manually manipulate that and maybe say that I want to pull this out a little bit and kind of design how I want that integration, this little kind of J hook into that surface. Okay, same thing with this one, curve and surface. Go into Edit Curves, Project Tangent. The default was set to U direction, so I'm going to make that the V direction. Okay. Now we're getting in a situation where the tangent is actually going the wrong way. So this is a point where you have reverse tangent in your channel box. So it says reverse tangent off. I'm going to hit 1 and make it on to flip it to go the other way. I may also want to make this tangency a little bit smaller. So you have a slider here called Tangent Scale also in the channel box. And by moving this, you can scale how far that second point is away from the surface. By actually scaling it negative, it's doing the same thing as the reverse tangent. So it's kind of a redundant tool there. So we can move that back so it's a little bit tighter. Maybe see how this works with my wheel well. Is it going to be penetrating it? Okay, so turn that off. And then manipulate the second CV here. Okay, and then say we're going to pull that out a little. So what I'm creating then is a nice smooth integration between the curve on surface and the curve off surface. Okay, so this curve on surface, our trim edge, nice integration between here using Project Tangent, and then our final surface over here. And then we need to use a tool that will allow us to fit this in. Well, we could use bi-rail, or we can use something called square. Okay, either one will get you a surface. Square is a little bit better in that it's going to make sure we have tangency along this edge because we can specify that. So we'll just do a little introduction on square. If I go into the square tool, which is under surfaces, and go to the options, we want to make sure continuity type is set to tangent, and then we're going to have everything else pretty much set up so that we're using the defaults. So this should all be okay. The default setting right there. So when I build something with square, I'm going to go in and pick on the necessary edges that I need. So I need this trim edge, and then pick clockwise or counterclockwise. Unlike bi-rail where you do a cross and generation to rail, I want to pick one curve, then shift select the curve that's touching it, and then the next one touching it, and then the complete closure of all four curves there. So we'll kind of pick them clockwise around, and then I go in and say square. Now square will give me that surface with fairly light point load. Okay, square builds a lot less points than bi-rail, and if we hit T or show manipulator right now, and I'll lower the res on all of our surfaces, just select all and go down to level 1. And then I'm going to pick on that surface again, click on the square input here, and then we'll turn off our shaded display. And what you can see is there's some markers going on here. Okay, one of them says tangent, and the other 3 say fixed. Now the one that's tangent is able to be tangent because square is referencing off an existing surface. On these other 3 curves that I built, coming around here, none of those were touching another surface, so there's no way of getting it tangent. Also, the only way you can get this edge tangent here is by making sure the curve that's coming off that edge, okay, which was our main body of surface here. So this curve coming off the main body, and then this curve coming off the main body needed to be tangent. And that's why we use the project tangent tool to make sure we have a nice tangency coming off that side. So click on square, and we can see we have tangency. This means that when we look at this smoothly, it should have a nice smooth tangent transition here. If you wanted to change that, you could click on that little tangent arrow, that blue arrow, and turn it to fixed, and now you're not going to have a nice tangent surface anymore. Okay, it's just making sure it's fixed down to that edge, but not necessarily smoothly integrated. So when you click on tangent, you're going to see a slight bump or slight change in that surface. Okay, you can also go in and see that this is the number 1 side here. It says 1 tangent. Okay, and then we can come in the channel box and say, let's change 1 to fixed. Okay, or come back and change it to tangent. Okay, so that'll make a nice clean surface. You can also clean up that trim edge, because we have a lot of isoparms going on here, by rebuilding the curve, which was really the trim curve used for that edge. So where it says 1 or tangent, if you come down in the square where it says rebuild curve off for number 1, you could turn that on as well, and that can sometimes reduce data. Sometimes it'll even put in more data. And you could even take it so far as trying to rebuild all of these. But typically I would rebuild just the trim edge. Okay, so this can make things cleaner or sometimes heavier depending on how you have it set up. Right, so that's a way that we can do that little fender integration. As far as the back wheel and this wheel well, we'll address it the same way, where if I have my wheel copy here and duplicate that and move it back and decide where I want to have my wheel, and then I'm just going to do a straight on draw curve and project it on. Just basically come in here and draw a curve on draw a curve off surface like that, pick my surface, so both these are selected, and then go in and project curve on surface, and then come back here and trim it out. Okay, keeping that whole section will be moved out of there. Okay, so we'd get something like this. Now we need to address some other details. Okay, if we come back in the model, I added some other things like this little lower rocker kind of bumper scooped out area here that has another fillet, namely a freeform fillet that is doing the transition between these 2 halves. Okay, so we have that surface going to that one through that little fillet here. And then we also have some other areas where we have that same kind of transition going from the body side here through a fillet and then onto the rest of the surface there. Okay, in both cases, this one as well as this one, I'm generating the surface by doing a little bit of an offset. Okay, so this I'm really cloning the existing surface and then turning it into another trim section that will be a little bit wider. Okay, so let's just hide this and take that curve. And first thing I'm going to do is generate a curve on surface where I want that bumper integration to happen. So I'm going to be projecting a curve on by going in to create CV curve and just draw a curve that kind of descends down towards the lower bumper area like that, which I'll select both of these and project curve on surface. Okay, so that'll give us that curve on surface that's basically marking where that line is going to be. And this we could trim out right now too. Trim, keep that, and then throw out that other piece. Now to create the lower piece, I want it to be kind of a clone of this one. So what I'm going to do here is take this and either do something like duplicating that same surface. So I made a second copy of it. And then go in here and scale it a little bit wider and maybe a little bit longer. Okay, and I'm kind of over exaggerating it, but we have a double shell here where I've duplicated the second surface and just kind of pulled it out a little bit wider and a little bit longer. If we want to get a very accurate distance between these where scale doesn't always work, we can make an offset copy that keeps equal distance between this shell and then the new one. So that is using the offset tool, where this is a surface, so we go into Edit NURBS, Offset Surface, and then if we look at the options here, you basically have an offset distance slider and then fit to the surface exactly or fit to the same number of CV points. So I'm just going to go in and hit apply on that. And then this will give us a ballooned out surface that is exactly the same distance away from the original all the way around. So it's different than a scaled copy. It actually keeps equal distance. And we can change the distance through this distance slider value. Okay, so we can go from, say, a negative value to a positive value and maybe type in how far we want to offset. Maybe it's like 0.1 or 0.15 centimeters away. And change the fit method so you can check that out, surface fit versus CV fit. Okay, use the same number of points. Sometimes it'll have to add more. In general, you're going to get the best results from offsetting outward. Okay, if you offset to the inside, you get this kind of twisting where the offset distance will start to wrap around itself, but going out will always make a nice surface. Okay, in kind of gets a little funky. So if you're ever going to use offset, try to offset to the outside or minimal inside offsetting. Okay, so that gives me another surface there. Now what I'm going to do for this is I'm going to go in and untrim that surface. Basically create the raw or starting point of my original surface, and then I need to come in here and trim it out again, only keeping these lower sections here. So in my offset, say of 0.1, and I can see that this curve is just a little bit too low. I actually need my curve on surface here to work with, but we can generate a new one either case. So that was the curve that I projected on the interior body. What I'm going to do is duplicate this one and just move it down a little bit, okay, to give me a little bit of ledge here between the original one and the second one. So that one I used to project the curve on the thinner surface. This one is a little bit lower, and I'm going to project it on the fatter surface. Okay, so I have that curve, and then I'm also going to draw another curve coming off here, maybe snapping it near where our wheel well was, and then we could redesign this. Maybe this comes down a little bit straighter, or I use the existing curve that I had before when I projected my trim out. Okay, but either one will work for this. So I have this curve and this surface. So this is a large amount of surface area to deal with. Let's just project this on. So project curve on surface. And you can see this is what I created, was this little trim from these two interior lines. This is our lower one. And then this is the other curve that I snapped down from the side here. Now if I go in and trim this, okay, with my trim tool, now I have, and I'm only going to keep just that section, and what we have is basically the same kind of duplicate of the other one with a little bit of step here because of our offset. And if you see that if we change the offset a little bit, we're moving that inside and out. Now with a little bit of ledge here of transition, I just want to build a nice integrated little fillet in between here. So I'm going to use the freeform fillet again, freeform fillet, and I'm going to go between this trim edge, okay, and then the lower trim edge, and then go in and institute the freeform fillet, which will do a nice smooth little blend transition between the upper and lower section here. So if you look at this closely, you'll get a little S transition as the fillet's trying to be tangent to both ends here. Now, if we mess around with our construction history a little bit, I can move that original curve that I projected on the thinner piece down, and we'll give ourselves a little more fillet area. So I'm going to take that curve and start to lower it a little bit. Okay, so what we're getting is more space for that fillet to do its work. If it's tighter, it'll end up with kind of a sharper ledge, and if we go too far, we'll go outside of our trim boundary, and then we can just give it a nice smooth little transition there. Okay, so that does a real subtle little change where this thing kind of bumps out. Neat little tool to add that kind of detail. Same thing is going to happen back here. Okay, where back in my model, okay, I have this little ledge that's happening between the upper and lower piece. So if we select that piece right there, this has also been halted because I start to trim back in some other detail, but the initial point was to take another curve offset of this surface and then trim it out and make a lower section here. Okay, so here's an example of what we can do for this piece. I have another copy of my model, okay, this piece, that was basically another offset here, and I draw a series of trim curves or curves on surface. So we have a cross section going on through here and then a little circular opening here. What we're looking at now is just the untrimmed version of that, so you can see where I started with this particular piece. So this one can also be trimmed out, okay, keeping basically the lower section and also that whole piece right there. Okay, so both of those are being trimmed. Now if I take this copy and again do something like duplicate or offset it, so let's make a copy of this and then just move it to the interior a little bit. Now I have a little bit more of an offset between these two, and if I try to do some kind of fillet between here, they're basically the same width in terms of like the diameter around that circle, so that one's not going to work so well for this. So if I untrim it again, basically set this up so that we can project more curves back on the surface. So let's move this to the exterior so we can look at it. And then I'm going to take a smaller version of the curve. So in my center line, you can see all the curves I kind of projected on here. There's one, and then there's a scaled down version of this. Or you can achieve this by taking the fatter one and kind of like offset surface, you can offset curve. So you can go into edit curve, offset, and say offset curve. And that can bring it to the interior or exterior. Say scale it down -0.25 and get something like that. But offset to the interior is not always that good. You can see that you get some weird corners, and I'm even getting a little bit of funkiness right there. So this particular one, offsetting, like I said, works better if you go out. And in this one, I just scaled the curve down a little bit and reshaped it some. So if I have that curve, and again our other trimmed out surface, and from my side view, I'm going to go in and project this curve on surface. So I have that one. And then the other curve that I projected, I really don't need. Okay, so this outside one I don't need this time. And we'll go back and retrim this. So going into my trim tool, and you can see all the boundaries again there. And we're going to keep this, keeping that smaller section, and just move it to the inside here. Okay, so it's just offset like that. And then go in and create a fillet. In this case, we could try to do a freeform fillet between those two. So selecting my trim edge and selecting that trim edge, and then go in and throw on your freeform fillet again. Okay, which will close off that section here. Okay, and that'll create that nice smooth little integration. Now, once I do this, I don't need that other piece anymore. This really isn't serving any purpose, so you could just delete it. Okay, so I just get rid of that little interior piece, and then we have our smooth little integration. And we could throw on something like a plane in the back if we wanted to, or actually do the entire trim out, again, keeping just that small piece. Now, trimming can be fairly heavy, and you can end up with a lot of surface. One way you can prevent some of the trimming kind of major amounts of surface here is when you're trimming out a surface, use what's called shrink surface. So if I untrim this surface, see how this is a much smaller section than the original body size that was really large. What trim with shrink does do is it detaches a lot of the surface that you're not going to be needing for this. For example, back here, I trimmed out by projecting a line back here where this kind of rear fender is. I projected out that piece, and if you look at the hulls, it really is a smaller piece of surface. If I went to my inputs for trimming when I did this, and you'll see there's a thing that says shrink. And if shrink is on or off, say like shrink off, this surface was much larger. Okay, now you can see all the hulls that represent that surface. Okay, let's just move this up for a second here. Actually, we're still projecting, so that's not going to look good. Let's bring it out to the side. And if I turn on the hulls, you can see that the entire surface still exists here. But if I'm only using a very small part, what it's going to do is basically detach a little boundary here along that surface and use the smallest amount possible. So if I turn shrink on, it's only using a small part of the surface that it needs to have the original NURB surface still fit inside that part of the model. So that's a good one for texture mapping too, because you're only trying to map a surface that's this big, say like UV or normal mapping, versus one that goes all the way around. So I'll take that object and just put it back to where it was. Okay, back in position. And then the other part of detail that I added here is I just projected another curve. Okay, just projected another curve and then offset a copy of the interior section, and we did just a little loft between those two pieces. So I had an inside shell and an outside shell, and just like the back piece here, I just threw it away afterwards. So we offset this, move it in, put that little, just that little loft between there, and then throw it away. And then the interior piece where the air intake is, I really just sculpted something at that point. Basically just taking a curve here from here to here and duplicating and pulling it up and just kind of reshape this to add a little bit of air intake. It was more manual CV manipulation than anything. You could do it other ways as well. Okay, for headlights, kind of the same thing. I took a curve from the side here and projected it, okay, right here onto the side, drawing a curve all the way through, and then building this piece or section afterwards. Now, notice on this one that the CVs and alignment don't quite look the same as what they did before, meaning that they're not following like a trimmed out isoparm kind of section here. This was actually a whole new surface. And when you're doing this, you can actually model this a couple of ways. One way is to take, again, another copy of your model and say if we duplicate it, hit Shift D. Okay, so I have this, and then I go in and untrim it, and then I come back here and retrim it, just keeping that piece. Okay, and then we could basically slot that little piece back into our model. And that's kind of like doing a trim divide where you're still keeping both sections, you're just making this one a new one with a different shader and things like that that you can throw on there. So that's one way to do it. The other way I did this is I duplicated the surface curve of the original surface, and then I duplicated a surface curve off of this trim edge. Okay, so I end up with basically one curve here and one curve right here. And if I hide this surface after we duplicated it, I extracted this form off here. Okay, which this originally was one complete curve. What I did afterwards is went in here and detached it right there and detached it right here, making this into a 4-curve section. And then go in and do something like bi-rail. Okay, so we'll use the bi-rail 2 tool and say bi-rail from that curve, so it'll let me pick it. Okay, bi-rail 2, going from that curve to that one along that rail and that rail. And that can slot in a little piece. Or we could try bi-railing it the other way and see if that looks better. 1, 2, 3, 4. okay, and get another piece inside there. It's just building kind of heavy at this point. Another way to do that is to try to square it. So we go into our square tool, okay, and pick 1, 2, 3, 4, and then come in here and square it, which could build a lighter section. And then bringing back the rest of the model, we can go in and do things like CV manipulation, and maybe rebuild this to lighten it up a little bit. Okay, so I rebuilt the square, and then grab some of the interior CVs. Okay, and this is again more manual CV manipulation. And say I want to have a little bit raised headlight right there, so I'll just go in and pull this up a little bit. Okay, kind of add a little bit of a bump there for the headlight section. And that's what I did for that part. And then the next thing, I trimmed out a little hole to get a little window kind of framing going on for the rest of that. So back on the other model here, this was our overall bi-rail, and then this piece was actually trimmed out of that. Okay, so there's two pieces going on here. This was all one original, and then it got trimmed out to make a smaller section, just so I could do a different shader assignment for that. Okay, now for the window section, what I would take is a series of curves that I draw from the side view. So 1, 2, 3, actually I have a couple of them inside here. And if we hide the rest of the model and come into our side view panel, we didn't get all of it, so let's show last hidden and select that one and then hide selection. Okay, now through this one, what I did was take a bunch of curves from the side view of how I want the front window to look like, and then the side window, and then the basically the back window section coming back to right here. Okay, so series of curves on how I want this trimmed out. Now in the other model, this one actually created so that the glass shell was on the exterior, and then the darker kind of window frame, or the whole kind of interior of the model, was on the inside. So this was the thinner model, was all the trimmed out kind of black trim for the window section. So coming back to this, I would actually trim this out a couple times. So I'm going to take all these curves and surface and go in and project the curve on there. Okay, project curve on surface. And make sure we have the right option. This was actually projecting from normal, so project curve on surface based on active view, this orthographic, and apply it. And then we can see where all these little window cuts are. Okay, and I make sure that when I'm drawing the curve, they go completely outside of the surface so we can get a complete closed off boundary here. Okay, so that'll be one of them. And then we trim it. And if I'm going to do the black kind of shell on the inside, I'm going to pick on the area that is basically not where the windows are. So it's all this section inside here. Okay, so we have this piece. And then we can throw on another shader. Okay, say we want to make this part black. So I'll just throw on that kind of a dark, shiny black shader on here. So let's use a little bit just lighter color for now. And then I want to duplicate that surface again. Okay, so I'll make a duplicate, which if we transform this or just move it away for a second. Okay, let's just move it up. And then I'm going to come in here and untrim it. Okay, so we have that piece. And then so we can see that we moved it away, and then I'm going to take this other one and just hide it temporarily, move this one back down into position where it was, and then go and reapply all those curves again. So select all the curves and surface, project curve on surface, and this time trimming out, keeping the window area. Okay, so we'll go back to trim and select the windows. Okay, so all those, and then hit enter. And it looks like one of those curves didn't go completely out, so just have to make sure we're doing that. Now the other model that I didn't actually go in and trim out those sections. I just kept the glass the way it was. Okay, so this one, actually not trimming, is probably not out all the way. So say we want to keep one of those windows, that kind of idea. But in the previous version, this was actually just an entire glass shell over the rest of it. Now this back piece that isn't trimming out, again, it's just an issue that we probably didn't completely exit the surface prior to trimming. So you want to make sure that from the hulls of the original surface, which may have extended longer, those things go completely out, or you actually make sure that this part goes completely out in the intersection right there. Okay, so that'll give you the entire pieces that you need for that puzzle, and then you reverse what you're trimming so you can keep everything together. Right, and then we have another section for the spoiler. Okay, this spoiler, if we look at the model here, okay, and there's our finalized window. This was done through just a couple of basically offsetting the midsection and also using a tool over here called bevel. Okay, so this piece was actually a beveled out copy of the model where this little fin is sitting right here. Okay, and then the rest of this is just lofted. So if we go over to the model, okay, if I take a curve like this, say if this is the profile curve that I drew from the side, and I'm going to go in and bevel this. So go down to surface and bevel, and this is going to create an extrusion as well as a little bit of a beveled edge here. Okay, this right now is just a straight line. Now through the options of bevel, I'm going to change this such that the extrusion depth is going to be more narrow, and then the depth of the bevel and the width of the bevel are going to change. Okay, so we can use a negative number here in the width, say like -2 or -0.2, to make that go the other way. And then if I want to get a little more rounded edge, we can change the bevel corner from straight cut to curve in or curve out. Okay, such as that, to get a little bit rounded section. In this case, I just did a straight cut here. Okay, and then decide how we want to scale that. Sometimes after the bevel, you can just center the pivot in the middle of that and then just do a regular scale. Okay, say non-proportionally scale that a little bit back and then reposition this to where I want it to be for our little spoiler section. Okay, and then to throw in the faces here of the bevel, just like if we're beveling text, I'm going to grab the isoparm right on the edge of that bevel and then go in and say planar. Okay, and that'll throw a cap on there, and then do the same thing for the other half. Isoparm, select that edge, and then go in and throw on a planar. Okay, so all together, the bevel and the pieces, we can group them. So Control G to group, and then I'll go in and mirror that to the other side. Okay, so mirror this along the z-axis, and we have our little spoiler section, which in between here we'll take this curve and just kind of move it to the inside here. Okay, that curve will be sitting there that we drew, and then duplicate it and just move it over to the other side. Okay, for the other half there, and then if we want to create like fillets or some kind of cleaner integration, that can be done as well. So I'll take both those pieces and just loft them together for now, just to create our little spoiler section. Okay, now the back fins and things that I'm doing like in here, okay, these you could also use the planar version of that, or you could also bevel that as well. And then for these little front vents, what I'm using for this is just simple polygon primitive cubes and just scaling them down, or actually cylinders, scaling them down and then just positioning them inside the surface. Okay, I'll show you just a quick little trick on that. Okay, what I do is build one of them here. Okay, and then hit the Control D to duplicate with transform, and then go in and move that down a little bit, okay, to mimic kind of what I have on the other side, and move it forward a little bit. and then hit Control D consecutive times just to mimic the same move that we had before. Okay, so I'm just making one copy and then doing multiple copies based on the same transform. And that's a little different than this one. This was just transformed a little more, so you just undo it and then redo it. Okay, so got most of that stuff pretty much covered. For this little air intake, that I used in an extrude. So if we look back on our other model, okay, it just extruded this by taking some kind of path curve and some kind of generation curve. So this will be the path that I want to follow, and then a generation curve could be something like a quick circle. So let's just hide some of this other stuff here, get it out of the way, and then I'll go in and create a NURB primitive circle, okay, which I'm going to snap right onto the end here using curve snap, and then go in and scale this appropriately. Okay, so if I want to make it a little bit more rounded, or grab some CVs here, okay, such as that, and say I want to scale them in, and then grab those two and scale them in. And then take the whole group and scale it down, and then say I want to take this curve along that path and do an extrusion, okay, using pretty much the defaults, other than the fact that you can change in extrusion this thing called scale, okay, where I can make that thing scale out a little bit wider at the end, okay, to make that air intake a little wider, or go in and grab some CVs off the end here, okay, right here, grab these couple rows of CVs and say let's just translate those even wider still. Okay, so I make this kind of flare out a little bit. And if I want to add just a quick little undercut, what I'll do is I'll insert an isoparm right here, okay, and throw in an extra isoparm right there at that selected location, and then grab a hull that's that thin one right at the middle and start to scale that down a little bit. Okay, so this will kind of round out that air intake, and you could even insert another isoparm here. Okay, so we'll do this again, and then grab that hull, the thinnest one to the inside, and start to pull that back. Okay, and then this could be scaled down as well. So you can create quick little openings just through extrude, and then throw a few extra isoparms on to give you kind of a nice rounded little edge here. Okay, something like that. As far as some of the rest of the detail, okay, so on here, these little caps that you're looking at, this little like air intake lift, you do this by using a curve on surface as well, and kind of doing a quick little fillet. Okay, so a way you could do this is go in and take that surface, make it live by hitting the little magnet at the top here. Go in and create a new CV curve that just follows the form. Okay, let's hide our wheel. Follow the form, kind of curve back around. Okay, so I'm making that as a live object. And then we're going to go in and select a edit point or a curve point right there in the middle of that curve and go in and detach it. Okay, so detach that curve into two separate pieces. And again, this will be our curve on surface because that piece is live. So it allows us to draw the curve on there. And then we take these two and go in and throw on a freeform fillet, which will close off the section there. And then the last thing I do is just come in and pick on a few control vertices towards the middle here. So I would grab those and just start pulling them up. Okay, so I can say, well, let's just pull this section up, and if we hit 3, we get a nice little scoop here, and then start jumping down to the next point on that surface. Okay, so go down to, with your picking tools, the arrow keys, and say, we'll pull this one down, arrow key, pull this one down, another arrow key, and then pull that one down a little bit more. Okay, so that can create a quick little air opening, and it looks nice and tangent smooth to the surface. And these I just took curves on surface, just drew a curve on there, duplicated, pulled it off, and then just did a quick loft in between. And then we have the side vents going on there as well. All right, so that pretty much covers how you can make all those sections of the model. In the end, we're going to get kind of a compilation of all these little pieces. The last thing I do is try to add all these little door cuts, okay, which in here I'm just projecting two curves on surface, basically two parallel lines running along from the beginning to the end here. Okay, and these are really, if you look at from the orthographic view of the model, and just like we were doing with the window, we just draw a curve that descends all the way through the model and then comes back out here. In the end, once you get your curves on surface projected, you just need to join them together if you want to add like a little black line, or do something like a loft where you're just lofting between, say, this trim edge and then this trim edge. So between those two pieces of the curve, and you can give it a little bit of a dark line there. Okay, that'll get a little more tedious because you have to deal with every separate section of surface. So this section where we created a little fillet will be one trim edge coming across here, and then it's going to stop and you have to deal with the next one coming back around the other side. So each one of those pieces will need to be addressed there. Okay, so that pretty much covers how to build the bulk of this. The rest of it is just adding little details like windshield wipers, antennas, and stuff like that. So that could give you a pretty good start, and you can go out and build a model just like this.